esteem. Let's start with something that many people miss. When a narcissistic person brings up one of your most humiliating moments, it is not random. It is not clumsy humor. It is not forgetfulness, esteem. And it is certainly not intimacy. It is strategy. Humiliation is one of the most powerful emotional states a human being can experience. Shame has a way of shrinking us. When you feel ashamed, esteem, your body actually responds, your shoulders drop, your voice gets softer, your eye contact decreases. You second-guess yourself. You want to disappear, esteem. Now imagine someone who benefits from you feeling smaller. Imagine someone who feels more powerful when you feel less secure, esteem. Bringing up your humiliating moments becomes an incredibly efficient way to lower you in real time. Think about how this often happens. You're in a social setting. Things are going well, esteem. You're relaxed, maybe you're even confident. And suddenly they say, esteem. Remember that time you messed up that presentation? Or tell them about that embarrassing thing you did in college. Everyone laughs. You feel exposed. You might force a smile. But inside, esteem, something drops. The emotional temperature shifts. And in that moment, they regain control of the room and of you. Control is the key here, esteem. Narcissistic dynamics are built on power regulation. They constantly scan for where they stand in the hierarchy of the relationship. If they sense that you are gaining confidence, esteem, independence, admiration, or simply stability, that can feel threatening to them. Your strength registers as their loss. So they recalibrate. They remind you of your lowest moment, esteem. They pull you back to a time when you felt unsure, clumsy, rejected, or ashamed. And just like that, the balance tilts back in their favor, esteem. What makes this especially painful is that they often frame it as humor, honesty. I'm just joking. You're too sensitive? It's not a big deal. But the impact tells a different story, esteem. Humor that consistently leaves one person feeling small is not connection, it is dominance disguised as playfulness. Over time, this repeated exposure to humiliation erodes your confidence, esteem. You may start anticipating it. You censor yourself, you avoid shining too brightly, you shrink preemptively to avoid being cut down. And here is where it becomes even more insidious, esteem. The more you internalize that shame, the easier you are to control. When someone believes they are flawed or foolish, they hesitate to assert themselves. They tolerate more disrespect, esteem. They doubt their own perception. The narcissistic individual does not need to yell or overtly threaten. They simply keep you uncertain. And uncertainty is fertile ground for control, esteem. There is also something very calculated about the timing. Notice when these humiliating stories surface. Often it's when you disagree with them, when you set a boundary, esteem, when you receive praise, when you are momentarily in a position of strength. The humiliation is deployed almost like an emotional reset button. It interrupts your momentum, esteem. It reminds you of who you are, or rather, who they want you to believe you are. This is not about healthy vulnerability. In healthy relationships, esteem, people may share embarrassing moments about themselves in ways that build mutuality. There is reciprocity, there is safety, there is laughter that feels warm, not cutting, esteem. In narcissistic dynamics, the vulnerability is one-sided. Your humiliations are ammunition. Theirs are off limits. That imbalance tells you everything you need to know. Over time, esteem, something subtle happens. You may start bringing up your own embarrassing moments before they do. You self-deprecate. You beat them to the punch. This is a protective maneuver, esteem. If you expose yourself first, maybe it won't hurt as much. But this adaptation reinforces the dynamic. You are now participating in your own diminishment, trying to maintain peace, esteem. The tragedy is that many survivors interpret this pattern as closeness. They know my worst moments. They've seen me at my lowest. But knowledge is not the same as care, esteem. A person who truly cares about you guards your vulnerable moments. They don't weaponize them, they protect them. So when a narcissistic person repeatedly resurrects your humiliation, esteem, understand what is happening beneath the surface. They are not reminiscing, they are regulating power. They are pulling emotional levers, esteem. They are reminding you that in their version of the relationship, you are meant to occupy the smaller seat. And once you see that, something shifts, esteem. Because humiliation only works as a weapon when you believe you deserve it. The moment you recognize it as a tactic, you reclaim psychological ground, esteem. You stop interpreting it as truth and start seeing it as strategy. And here's the bottom line: when someone repeatedly uses your shame to control you, that is not love, that is power, esteem. Let's take this one step further, because humiliation is not just about making you feel bad. It is about rearranging the hierarchy in the relationship, esteem. When a narcissistic person brings up your most embarrassing or painful moments, they are doing something very specific. They are rewriting the power dynamic in real time, esteem. Narcissistic relationships are rarely equal. On the surface, they may look balanced. There may be charm, success, even admiration. But underneath, there is often an unspoken ladder, esteem. Someone has to be on top, someone has to be admired, someone has to be right. And when that balance feels threatened, they will act quickly to restore their position. Steam. Imagine you've just accomplished something. You're feeling proud, maybe others are complimenting you. There's a glow about you, a steadiness. And then, almost like clockwork, they interject, esteem. Well, let's not forget that time you completely messed up. The room laughs. The attention shifts. Suddenly, you're defending yourself or minimizing your achievement. What just happened? Esteem. The hierarchy was reestablished. This isn't accidental. When you shine, it can feel destabilizing to someone who depends on being the center of gravity. Esteem. Your confidence challenges their narrative of superiority. And rather than rising with you, they pull you back down. It's quicker, it's easier. Esteem. And it preserves their internal story that they are the stronger, smarter, more composed one in the relationship. Pay attention to the subtle messaging embedded in these moments. Esteem. When they retell your humiliating story, they often narrate it in a way that emphasizes your incompetence, naivety, or foolishness. Even the tone matters, a slight smirk, a dramatic pause, esteem, an exaggerated detail. Meanwhile, they position themselves as the observer, the commentator, the one who knows better. It reinforces a narrative: I am stable. You are flawed. Over time, esteem. That narrative starts to seep into your own self-concept. You may begin to feel that you are the less capable one. You might defer more. Ask for reassurance more often. Esteem. Second, guess your decisions. That internal shift is not random, it serves the dynamic. When one person doubts themselves, the other person gains influence. Esteem. What makes this particularly confusing is that narcissistic individuals often oscillate between praise and humiliation. One moment, they may elevate you, esteem, tell you how talented or special you are. And just when you begin to settle into that affirmation, they puncture it with a reminder of your worst moment. This push-pull creates instability. Esteem. You never quite know where you stand. And in that instability, the power tilts toward them. There is also a deeper psychological layer here. Esteem. Many narcissistic individuals have a fragile internal sense of self. They rely on comparison to feel solid. If you are competent, admired, or confident, esteem, it can unconsciously trigger their own insecurities. Rather than processing those feelings, they neutralize the threat. Esteem. And one of the fastest ways to neutralize someone's confidence is to remind them of a time they felt small. But here's the part I really want you to understand. This is not about your mistake. Esteem. Everyone has humiliating moments. Everyone has stories they wish they could erase. In healthy relationships, those moments are handled with compassion. They become shared humanity. Esteem. In narcissistic dynamics, they become leverage. Leverage maintains hierarchy. And once a hierarchy is established, it subtly governs everything. Who apologizes first? Esteem. Whose needs get prioritized? Whose career matters more? Whose emotions are taken seriously? The person who occupies the lesser role in the hierarchy often works harder for approval. Esteem. They over-explain, they over-function. They try to earn equality instead of assuming it. That is the hidden cost of this dynamic. You start performing for your worth. Esteem. You might even notice that when you attempt to challenge them, when you point out something unfair or hurtful, they quickly pivot to one of your past humiliations. Esteem. It's a fast derailment tactic. Suddenly, instead of discussing their behavior, you're defending your past. Esteem. The conversation shifts away from accountability and back toward your perceived flaws. The hierarchy is restored once again, and the more this happens, the more entrenched it becomes. Esteem. It becomes almost automatic. You feel the sting, they feel the upper hand. No overt argument is needed. The structure remains intact, but hierarchies in intimate relationships are not healthy. Esteem. Partnership requires mutual respect. It requires two people who can hold their own strengths and weaknesses without weaponizing them. Esteem. When one person consistently positions themselves above the other, intimacy erodes. What remains is control masked as connection. So if you find yourself constantly cast in the role of the one who messed up, the overly sensitive one, the less competent one, pause. Esteem. Ask yourself whether these humiliating reminders are coincidences or corrections. Are they being used to subtly remind you of your place? Because once you see the pattern, esteem, it becomes harder for it to work. When you recognize that the story is being retold not for ladder, not for bonding, but for dominance, something inside you recalibrates. Esteem. You stop accepting the assigned role. And here is the truth that shifts everything. A person who needs you to feel small in order to feel big is not standing tall. They are standing on you. Esteem. Now let's talk about something even deeper, because this pattern is not just about power in the present moment. It's about time travel. Esteem. When a narcissistic person brings up one of your most humiliating experiences, they are not just reminding you of a story. Esteem. They are attempting to pull you back into the emotional state you were in when it happened. Humiliating moments are rarely neutral memories. They are encoded with emotion. Esteem, maybe you felt rejected, maybe you felt exposed, maybe you felt foolish or inadequate. Your nervous system remembers that. Even if you've grown since then, even if you've healed, esteem, that memory carries a trace of the original emotional charge. So when they bring it up, it's not just information, it's activation. Have you ever noticed how quickly your body responds? Esteem. Your stomach tightens, your face gets warm. You might stumble over your words. It can feel like you're suddenly younger, less composed, less confident. That is not weakness. Esteem, that is regression. And regression is incredibly powerful in relational dynamics. In healthy relationships, when old wounds surface, there is care, there is reassurance. Esteem, there is space for growth. In narcissistic dynamics, the goal is often the opposite. The goal is to destabilize you just enough to make you easier to manage. Esteem. When you are emotionally activated, your critical thinking narrows. You're less likely to calmly assert yourself. You may scramble to explain or defend. Esteem. You might even apologize for something that happened years ago. And in that activated state, the power imbalance deepens without you even realizing it. This is why timing matters so much. Esteem. Notice when these humiliating memories are brought up. Often it's during a disagreement, or right after you set a boundary, or when you express dissatisfaction. In other words, esteem, when you are standing firmly in the present. By dragging you back into the past, they interrupt your stability. It's a psychological reset. Esteem. You might begin the conversation grounded and articulate. Then the humiliating story surfaces. Suddenly, you feel exposed. You're no longer the confident adult in the room. Esteem. You're the person who made that mistake. And from that regressed state, you are far less likely to maintain your boundary. Esteem. This dynamic is particularly potent if the humiliating moment occurred during childhood or adolescence. Early shame experiences can shape our core beliefs about ourselves. Esteem. I'm not good enough. I'm awkward. I mess things up. If those beliefs were planted early, they are already sensitive areas. A narcissistic person doesn't have to invent new insecurities. Esteem. They simply press on the existing ones. And here's something important: many survivors blame themselves for overreacting. They think, why does this still bother me? Esteem. It was so long ago. But the reaction isn't about the timeline, it's about the emotional imprint. When someone intentionally reactivates that imprint, your response is human. Over time, esteem, repeated regression can erode your sense of growth. You may begin to feel like you're not evolving, like no matter how much you mature, you're still defined by your worst moment. Esteem. It creates a kind of psychological stuckness. You can't fully step into who you are now because you're constantly being dragged back to who you were then. Esteem. And that stuckness serves the dynamic, because a person who feels perpetually flawed is more likely to tolerate mistreatment. Esteem. A person who feels like they're still that embarrassing version of themselves is more likely to accept criticism as deserved. Esteem. The narcissistic individual benefits from keeping you psychologically anchored to your lowest point. There's also an element of unpredictability here. Esteem. You never quite know when the story will resurface. That unpredictability keeps your nervous system on edge. You may start monitoring your behavior carefully. You may avoid certain topics. Esteem. You may even disconnect from parts of yourself that feel vulnerable. This constant self-monitoring is exhausting, but it also keeps you preoccupied. Esteem. And preoccupied people are easier to control. What's especially tragic is that growth becomes invisible in this dynamic. You could have learned, matured, transformed completely. Esteem. But if someone keeps defining you by your most humiliating moment, it's as if your evolution doesn't count. You are frozen in their narrative. But here's the truth. Esteem regression only works if you accept the identity being handed back to you. When you notice that wave of shame rising, pause. Recognize it as activation, not reality. You are not that moment. Esteem. You are not that mistake. You are the person who survived it, learned from it, and moved forward. The attempt to drag you backward is a tactic, not a truth. Esteem. And once you begin to separate your present self from that old emotional imprint, something powerful happens. The story may still be told. The words may still be spoken. Esteem. But the emotional hook weakens. You stay in the present. You stay grounded. You refuse to shrink into a former version of yourself. Because here is the bottom line. Esteem. You are allowed to outgrow your worst moments, even if someone else insists on living in them. Now let's look at another layer of this dynamic. Esteem. Because sometimes the resurfacing of your most humiliating moments isn't just about control or hierarchy or even regression. Sometimes it is about escape. Specifically, esteem, their escape from accountability. Narcissistic individuals often have a very fragile relationship with criticism. Even mild feedback can feel to them like an attack. A simple statement, esteem, that hurt my feelings, or I didn't like how you spoke to me, can trigger defensiveness that seems wildly disproportionate. And in that split second when they feel exposed, esteem, their system goes into protection mode. That is when the deflection happens. You might begin by calmly addressing something they did. You're trying to stay focused, esteem. You're trying to resolve an issue. And suddenly, instead of responding to what you're saying, they pivot. Well, what about the time you embarrassed yourself at that dinner? Or, esteem. You're talking about my behavior. Remember when you messed up that project? Just like that, the spotlight shifts. It's psychological smoke and mirrors, esteem. Instead of examining their own behavior, the conversation becomes about you. Not just you in general, you at your most vulnerable, you at your worst moment. The energy in the room changes. Esteem. You feel defensive. You start explaining. Maybe you start apologizing for something that has nothing to do with the current issue. The original topic disappears. This is not accidental, esteem. It is strategic redirection. Accountability requires emotional maturity. It requires the ability to tolerate discomfort and say, esteem, I made a mistake. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, that admission can feel annihilating. So rather than sitting with that discomfort, they displace it, esteem. They take the uncomfortable feeling of being wrong and project it back onto you. Notice how effective this can be. Human beings are wired to respond to shame, esteem. When someone throws one of your humiliating memories into the conversation, your nervous system reacts immediately. You may feel flooded. Your thoughts scatter. In that moment, esteem, it becomes incredibly difficult to hold your ground and say, we're not talking about that right now. Over time, this pattern can train you to avoid raising concerns altogether. Esteem. If every attempt at accountability results in your past being weaponized, you may decide it's safer to stay silent. You may swallow your feelings. Esteem. You may tell yourself it's not worth the fight. And silence, once again, protects the dynamic. There's also a subtle moral reversal that happens in these moments. Esteem. You begin the conversation addressing their behavior. But after the deflection, you are suddenly the one being scrutinized. You are the one being analyzed. You are the one who seems flawed. Esteem. It creates confusion. You may walk away wondering how a conversation about their hurtful comment turned into a review of your past mistakes. This is a classic derailment tactic, esteem. And here's something important to understand: the humiliating story they choose is rarely random. It's often something they know still stings, something unresolved, esteem, something that will destabilize you quickly. They are not just bringing up history, they are selecting leverage. If this happens repeatedly, it can erode your sense of fairness, esteem. You might begin to believe that you are equally responsible for every conflict, even when you're not. You might internalize a narrative that says, team, I can't criticize them because I've messed up too. But that is a false equivalence. Everyone makes mistakes. Accountability is not reserved for the flawless, esteem. Healthy relationships allow space for both partners to own their behavior without dragging in unrelated history as ammunition. Conflict stays contained. It stays relevant, esteem. It doesn't become a courtroom where old cases are reopened whenever one person feels uncomfortable. But in narcissistic dynamics, relevance often doesn't matter. What matters is winning, esteem. What matters is not being the one at fault. And if shifting attention to your most humiliating moment accomplishes that, it will be used. The long-term effect of this is subtle but powerful, esteem. You may begin to doubt your right to address problems. You may hesitate before expressing hurt. You might even preemptively confess old mistakes just to soften the ground. In doing so, esteem, you unintentionally reinforce the idea that your flaws are always on trial. But let me say this clearly: your past mistakes do not invalidate your present boundaries, esteem. When someone responds to feedback by attacking your history, that tells you far more about their inability to self-reflect than it does about your worth. Deflection is not defense, esteem, it is avoidance. And here is where your power begins to return. The moment you recognize the pivot, the sudden shift from their behavior to your humiliation, you can name it internally, esteem. You can anchor yourself. You can calmly bring the conversation back to the present issue. You may not change their behavior, but you refuse to participate in the derailment, esteem. Because accountability is not cruelty, it is growth. And if someone consistently avoids growth by weaponizing your shame, the problem is not your past, esteem. It is their refusal to look at themselves. And here is the truth that cuts through the smoke: when someone attacks your history to avoid owning their behavior, esteem, they are not defending themselves, they are hiding. Let's look at another piece of this pattern, because sometimes when a narcissistic person brings up your most humiliating moments, esteem, it's not only about power regression or deflection, it's also about testing you, quietly, repeatedly, strategically. Every time they mention that embarrassing story, esteem, every time they retell that painful moment, they are gathering data. They are watching your reaction. Do you laugh it off? Do you shrink? Do you protest? Do you go silent, esteem? Your response tells them exactly how far they can go. This is how boundaries get mapped in narcissistic dynamics, not through healthy conversations, but through experimentation. Esteem. The first time they bring it up, you might feel shocked. You might say, "Why would you tell that story?" They might dismiss you. "Relax, it's funny." If you drop it, that's information. Esteem. If you force a smile to keep the peace, that's information. If you later minimize your own discomfort, "Maybe I'm being too sensitive," that's information. Each time you tolerate it, esteem, the boundary shifts. And here's the subtle part: they may not escalate immediately. They may space it out, they may wait for the right audience. They may frame it as affection or humor, esteem. But the underlying process is the same. They are checking whether your emotional limits are firm or flexible. In healthy relationships, when someone says, esteem, the other person adjusts. The boundary is respected. In narcissistic dynamics, a boundary can feel like a challenge. Instead of adjusting, they may probe further. Esteem. Not always aggressively, sometimes playfully, sometimes indirectly. But the probing continues. Why? Because control thrives where boundaries are unclear. Esteem. If you allow one humiliating story to pass without consequence, it becomes easier for them to bring up another. If you stay quiet when they mock your insecurity, esteem, it signals that your discomfort is negotiable. Over time, what once felt shocking begins to feel normal. That normalization is not accidental, it's conditioning. Esteem. You may start preparing yourself internally. They always tell that story. You brace, you numb, you detach slightly when it happens, but bracing is not the same as safety. It's adaptation. Esteem. And adaptation in this context often means shrinking. Some people cope by joining in on their own humiliation. They tell the story first. They exaggerate it. They try to appear unbothered. Esteem. On the surface, it looks confident, but underneath, it can be a protective maneuver. If I control the narrative, maybe it won't hurt as much. If I laugh at myself first, esteem, maybe they won't use it against me. But here's the risk: when you preemptively humiliate yourself to avoid being humiliated by someone else, esteem, you're still operating inside their boundary violation. There's also something deeply destabilizing about inconsistent reactions. Sometimes they may respond warmly when you assert a boundary. Esteem. Other times they may punish it with sarcasm, withdrawal, or more humiliation. This unpredictability makes it even harder to hold firm. You start calculating. Esteem. Is this worth the fallout? Should I just let it go? That calculation drains you. Over time, esteem, the emotional cost of asserting yourself may feel higher than the cost of tolerating the humiliation. And that's when the boundary test has succeeded. Esteem. But let's pause here and reclaim something important. A boundary is not a negotiation about whether your feelings are valid. A boundary is information about what you will and will not accept. Esteem. It doesn't require their agreement to be legitimate. When someone repeatedly brings up your humiliating moments despite knowing it hurts you, they are not misunderstanding you. Esteem. They are measuring you. They are seeing whether you will hold your line or retreat. And here's the truth: the longer you retreat, the harder it becomes to reclaim that space. Esteem. Not because you are weak, but because patterns solidify. The dynamic begins to feel fixed. This is just how we are. But dynamics are reinforced through repetition. Esteem. What is repeated becomes normalized. What is normalized becomes expected. The good news is that boundaries can be reset. It may not be comfortable. It may provoke resistance. Esteem. When you calmly and consistently refuse to participate, when you do not laugh, do not engage, and if necessary, remove yourself, you send new information. Esteem. The experiment no longer yields the same reward. You may not change them, but you absolutely change the dynamic. And this is where your power returns in a very tangible way. Esteem. Not in dramatic confrontations, not in winning arguments, but in small, consistent acts of self-respect. Each time you refuse to accept humiliation as humor, esteem, you reinforce a different hierarchy, one where your dignity is not up for testing. Because here is the bottom line: if someone keeps testing your boundaries with your shame, esteem, the issue is not your sensitivity, it's their disrespect. Now we come to one of the deepest and most painful layers of this pattern: esteem. Because when a narcissistic person repeatedly brings up your most humiliating moments, it doesn't just control you, destabilize you, or test your boundaries. Esteem. It can create something even more powerful: a shame bond. Shame is a profoundly attaching emotion. When you feel ashamed in front of someone, especially someone you care about, esteem, there is often an instinct to repair, to fix, to prove yourself, to earn back dignity. If the same person who exposes your shame is also the person whose approval you crave, esteem, that creates a very complicated emotional loop. You may find yourself trying harder after they humiliate you, trying to be more impressive, more agreeable, more successful, more lovable. Esteem. On the surface, it looks like motivation, but underneath, it's often a bid for redemption. Maybe if I do better, they won't see me that way anymore. But here's the painful part, esteem. In narcissistic dynamics, the goalposts keep moving. The shame never fully clears. Even if you accomplish something extraordinary, that old humiliating story can still resurface, esteem. Not because you haven't grown, but because your growth threatens the structure of the relationship. This creates a cycle. They remind you of your worst moment. You feel small, esteem. You try to rise above it. For a while, you may even receive praise. Then, just as you begin to feel secure, the shame resurfaces again. And each time, the bond tightens, esteem. This is very similar to trauma bonding. The same person who wounds you also becomes the person you seek comfort or validation from. Your nervous system gets caught in that push-pull, esteem, pain followed by relief, criticism followed by occasional affection. The inconsistency deepens the attachment. Why? Because unpredictability intensifies focus, esteem. You may start measuring your worth through their reactions. If they're warm, you feel stable. If they're mocking or dismissive, you feel exposed. Your internal compass slowly shifts outward, esteem. Instead of asking, "How do I see myself?" you begin asking, "How do they see me today?" That is the quiet erosion of self-trust. And shame accelerates it, esteem. Shame whispers that you are fundamentally flawed, that your humiliating moments reveal your true self. When someone keeps reintroducing those moments into the present, esteem, it reinforces that whisper. Even if logically you know you've grown, emotionally you may still feel stained by it. The tragedy is that many survivors interpret this attachment as love, esteem. They know everything about me. They've seen me at my worst. But knowing your worst moments and protecting your worst moments are two very different things. One builds safety, esteem. The other builds dependency. If someone repeatedly reminds you of your lowest point and you find yourself trying to win back their respect, pause. Notice that dynamic. Ask yourself, esteem, am I trying to prove my worth to someone who benefits from me doubting it? Because that is the core of the shame bond. You become invested in changing their perception of you, esteem. You want them to see you as competent, admirable, strong. And as long as they hold the power to define you through your humiliation, you remain tethered to their approval. Esteem, breaking that bond requires something radical: reclaiming your narrative. Your humiliating moments are part of your story, but they are not your identity. They are chapters, not the title, esteem. Growth is not erased by someone else's repetition. The only way the shame bond continues is if you accept their version of you as authoritative. When you begin to see the pattern, the control, esteem, the hierarchy, the regression, the deflection, the boundary testing, something shifts internally. The humiliation loses its mystical power. It becomes what it always was: a tactic, esteem. And once you recognize it as a tactic, the attachment begins to loosen. You no longer scramble to redeem yourself. You no longer try to outgrow a story that they insist on replaying, esteem. You understand that the repetition serves them, not you. And with that clarity, you can start redirecting your energy away from earning their validation and toward rebuilding your own esteem. Because true healing is not about convincing someone else that you are worthy. It is about remembering that you always were, even in your most embarrassing, flawed human moments, esteem. So let me leave you with this. If someone keeps tying you to your worst day, it may be because they're afraid of who you become when you finally let it go.